The sky over Dustwater County had turned the color of a sick parrot. It was a vile, greenish yellow, a shade that promised nothing good. Maybelline Crane felt it on her skin before she saw it, a pressure in the air that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The wind, which had been a constant, sighing companion for weeks, was gathering its breath for a real scream. It kicked up the red Kansas dirt, not in playful eddies, but in stinging sheets that scoured her cheeks like a handful of salt. From her small porch, she could smell the parched earth, a scent like baked clay, and beneath it, the electric tang of a storm that held its rain back out of pure spite. Down in the hollow where the town of Dustwater huddled, the church bell began to toll. It was not the cheerful Sunday summons, but a slow, heavy clang, one note at a time. A warning. She watched the distant shapes of storefronts disappear as merchants slammed their shutters closed. A line of cattle, looking like tiny black beads on a string, was being hurried from a far pasture by a rancher on a horse that seemed to fight the wind with every step. Everyone was running for cover. Everyone but her. She still had the west paddock gate to secure. Maybelline pulled the worn kerchief from around her neck and retied it over her hair, tucking the stray wisps of brown away from her face. The cotton was soft from 1,000 washings, a small comfort against the growing unease. It was an oath she renewed each morning, tying that knot, an oath to keep going, an oath to Silas, though he was 2 years gone, laid to rest under the big cottonwood on the hill. He had loved this land with a fierce, quiet passion that had eventually broken his body. Now it was hers to love, and hers to fight for. Her boots made soft thuds in the dust as she walked toward the barn. The building sagged to one side, like an old man with a bad hip. Another thing to fix. The list was endless. A serpent that ate its own tail. Fix the roof, buy the seed, pay the taxes, mend the fence, and by the time you finished, the roof was leaking again. The thought of the tax bill sitting on her small kitchen table, the paper crisp with official threats, made a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Mr. Henderson at the bank had been polite, but his eyes held the flat. Impersonal pity she had come to despise. A woman alone, they all thought, a lamb waiting for the wolves. They did not know the steel that grief had forged in her bones. She bypassed the barn, giving its groaning frame a wide berth, and headed for the tool shed. Her herd was small, just a dozen head of hardy longhorns, but they were hers. They were the last living remnant of the dreams she and Silas had built with blistered hands and shared whispers in the dark. Losing them was not an option. Losing the land was unthinkable. It would be like digging Silas up and burying him all over again in some unmarked potter's field. Inside the shed, the air was thick with the smells of grease, old leather, and hay. She grabbed a coil of heavy rope. Her gaze fell for a moment on the shelf where Silas's old revolver lay, wrapped in an oily cloth. She had never fired it, but she knew how. He had insisted. The world ain't always kind. May, he had said, his large hands gently guiding hers. You gotta be your own kindness sometimes, and your own thunder. She checked it once a week, cleaning and oiling it, the cold weight of it a strange and solid reassurance. It was another promise. Back outside, the wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, staggering her. It howled now, a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the very plains themselves. The green in the sky was deeper, infused with a bruised purple along the horizon. It was a tornado sky. She had seen it twice before in her life, and the memory was a cold stone in her gut. She leaned into the wind, her head down, and made for the far fence line. The west paddock was the most vulnerable, a wide-open stretch of land with nothing but wire and hope to keep her cattle from bolting in a panic. As she walked, her eyes drifted to the lone peach tree standing beside the weathered frame of her house. Silas had planted it their first spring here. Its branches were bare now, twisted against the violent sky like arthritic fingers. He had promised her peaches, buckets of them. So many she would get sick of the taste. He had died before the first fruit ever ripened. The tree was a memory, a sweet and aching thing that bloomed defiantly every year, a testament to a future that never was. The people in Dustwater were good folks. Mostly, they would bring a casserole after a funeral and offer a ride into town if they saw you walking. But they were also watchers. Their kindness came with a ledger of unspoken expectations and a healthy dose of suspicion. They watched her, the widow Crane, to see if she would fail. She saw it in the way Mrs. Gable from the Mercantile would ask about her dwindling supplies, her voice dripping with sympathy that felt more like a prediction. She heard it in the whispers that Sheriff Miller's wife tried to hide behind her fan at church socials. A woman cannot run a ranch. It is not natural. It is a temporary state of affairs. Before she either sells up or remarries, she would do neither. This land was soaked with her sweat and Silas's blood, and she would not surrender it. The dignity of labor, Silas used to say, was the only true prayer. So she prayed with the shovel, the hammer, and the needle. She prayed by rising before the sun and falling into bed long after it had set, her muscles screaming a chorus of exhaustion. She was living decently, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. That was the point. It was a conversation between her, God, and the unyielding earth. Finally, she reached the gate. It was a heavy handmade thing of rough-hewn timber, and the wind fought her for every inch as she tried to swing it closed. The air was electric, thick and hard to breathe. The world had gone unnaturally dark, the sun swallowed by the monstrous, swirling clouds. A strange calm fell, a sudden, deafening silence as the wind held its breath. The birds were gone, the insects were quiet. It was the pause before the world tore itself apart. She threw her shoulder against the wood, her muscles straining. The latch was swollen, stubborn. She grunted, her feet slipping in the loose dirt. Just a little more. The silence was more terrifying than the roar had been. In that quiet, she could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. She heard the creak of the barn, a sound like a bone snapping. She thought of the cattle, huddled together in the far corner of the pasture, their eyes wide with animal terror. They were depending on her. With a final, desperate shove, the latch fell into place. A wave of relief, sharp and clean, washed over her. She had done it. The fence was secure. She leaned against the gate for a moment, catching her breath, the rough wood pressing into her back. The silence broke. A new sound began, a low rumble that was not thunder. It was a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the soles of her boots, a sound that the mind knew before the ears could name it. Slowly, Maybelline Crane turned and looked back toward the bruised, churning horizon. Her breath caught in her throat. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a living, breathing monster, and descending from its churning belly, a dark, slender finger of cloud was reaching for the earth. It swayed, hypnotic and graceful, a beautiful, terrible dancer of destruction. The rumble grew into a roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains bearing down on her small, lonely patch of Kansas. The funnel cloud had formed, and it was coming straight for her. For a frozen second, all Maybelline could do was stare. The world had become a painting of chaos, and she was a tiny, insignificant figure in the corner of the canvas. The instinct, raw and primal, screamed at her to run. The storm cellar, dug by Silas's own hands into the hard-packed earth beside the house, was her only salvation. It was a dark, cramped hole, but it was safe. Her legs tensed, ready to sprint. Then a sound cut through the roar of the approaching funnel, a high, terrified whinny. Daisy. Her little dun mare was in the small corral beside the collapsing barn, rearing against the fence, her eyes white with panic. Daisy was her transport, her companion on lonely rides, the last living thing on this farm that truly felt like family. Maybelline's heart fractured. Leaving the mare was not a choice. It was a betrayal. She could try to get her into the relative safety of the barn's one standing stall. It was a fool's chance, but it was a chance. She changed direction, her boots digging into the soil as she ran toward the corral, her mind a frantic blur of latches and lead ropes. The wind tore at her skirt, whipping it around her legs, trying to trip her. Debris began to pepper the air leaves, twigs, then a loose shingle from the house that cartwheeled past her head with a vicious whistle. And then she saw him. He was a heap of dark clothing and sprawled limbs, tangled in the very paddock fence she had just secured. A horse, a magnificent black stallion with a silver-trimmed saddle, lay dead a few yards away, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. The man must have been riding the fence line when the storm hit, thrown clear and into the wire. He was not moving. Time seemed to warp and stretch. The roar of the tornado was now a constant, deafening reality, pressing in on her from all sides. To her left was Daisy, her one living link to her past, a creature of flesh and warm blood that she loved. To her right was a man, a complete stranger, motionless and possibly already dead. The barn groaned, a sound of timbers surrendering to an impossible force. The cellar was 50 yards away. She could not save them both. She might not even be able to save one. A piece of the barn roof, a huge sheet of corrugated tin, peeled away and soared into the sky like a monstrous kite. That was Daisy's shelter. Gone. The choice was made for her in the most brutal way imaginable. She could not save her horse. She could only try to save the man. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. She turned from the screaming mare and ran toward the fence line, a sob catching in her throat, swallowed by the wind. Dust and grit filled her mouth and scoured her eyes, forcing her to squint into the maelstrom. She reached the man and knelt, her hands finding the rough fabric of his coat. He was heavy, solidly built, and completely limp. His head was bleeding from a long, ugly gash on his forehead where he must have struck a fence post. He was caught fast in the wire. A loop of it twisted cruelly around his boot, and another pinned his coat to a post. She fumbled with the wire, her fingers clumsy and numb. The barbs tore at her skin, and she felt the warm sting of blood. But she barely registered the pain. The world was noise and fury. The sky was a churning vortex of dirt, wood, and destruction. She worked frantically, pulling and twisting the wire until his boot came free. She tore his coat clear of the post with a savage rip of fabric. Now came the impossible part. She hooked her arms under his, trying to get a purchase. He was dead weight. She braced her feet, leaned back, and pulled with everything she had. He moved an inch. "Come on," she grunted, the words ripped from her lips. "You are not dying here. Not today." She pulled again, her boots sliding, her back screaming in protest. It was like trying to drag an anchor through sand. Splinters from the shattered fence posts dug into her palms. The air was so thick with dust she could barely breathe. She could feel the ground trembling beneath her, the vibration of the tornado's awesome power. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The funnel was closer now, a monstrous, swaying pillar of blackness that filled the sky, its roar a physical presence that shook her to the bone. She gave a desperate, agonized heave, and the man's body slid free of the wreckage. She half fell backward, his weight pulling her down. She scrambled back up, grabbing him again. She could not lift him. She could only drag him. She began to move backward, one agonizing step at a time, her heels digging in, her arms feeling as if they were being pulled from their sockets. His boots scraped along the ground, leaving 2 shallow furrows in the dirt. Every few feet she had to stop, her lungs burning, her vision swimming with black spots. The wind was a solid wall she had to push through. It clawed at them, trying to pry him from her grasp. A fence post, ripped from the earth, flew past them, tumbling end over end. It would have killed them both instantly. The house was screaming now, the sound of wood splintering and glass shattering, She did not look. She kept her eyes on the cellar door. A simple angled piece of wood set into the ground. It was her entire world. It was life. She reached the door, her body shaking with exhaustion. The storm was on them. The pressure in the air dropped, and her ears popped painfully. She let go of the man and fumbled for the thick wooden handle of the door. The wind was trying to suck it upward. She had to put her full weight on it just to keep it down, then find the strength to slide the bolt. The wood was vibrating so hard it felt alive. The bolt slid free with a jarring crack. She heaved the door open, and it was immediately caught by the wind and slammed back against the earth. The opening was a black square of safety. She turned back to the man. There was no time to be gentle. She grabbed the collar of his coat and pulled, tumbling him headfirst down the steep wooden steps into the darkness below. He landed with a heavy, sickening thud. Without a second's hesitation, she scrambled in after him, pulling the heavy door down over her head. It slammed shut with a boom that echoed in the small space, plunging them into absolute darkness. The roar of the outside world was instantly muffled, but it was replaced by something almost worse, the feeling of the earth itself shaking. The door above them rattled and jumped in its frame as if a giant were trying to beat it down. Dirt rained down from the ceiling boards. Gasping, Maybelline felt her way along the damp earthen wall to a small shelf. Her trembling hands found a tin of matches and the cold glass of an oil lamp. It took her 3 tries to strike a match, the sulfur flaring and immediately extinguishing in the turbulent air. The 4th match caught. She lifted the lamp's chimney and touched the flame to the wick. A small, golden light pushed back the suffocating blackness. It was a feeble light, but it was enough. She was in a small 10 by 10-foot space, surrounded by shelves of preserved vegetables and fruits in glass jars. And on the floor at the bottom of the steps lay the stranger. He was groaning, a low, pained sound. He was alive. She knelt beside him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It swayed with the violent vibrations from the storm, the flame dipping and soaring, but it did not go out. It held on, a tiny, stubborn speck of life in the heart of the tempest. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, distant blue, clouded with pain and confusion. He tried to push himself up on an elbow and collapsed back with a gasp. "You," he rasped, his voice rough. "You pulled me." Maybelline nodded, trying to catch her breath. She pushed a stray, dirt-caked strand of hair from her face. "You picked a bad day to fall into my yard," she said, her own voice sounding strange and breathless to her ears. A flicker of something, maybe humor, crossed his face. He licked his dry, cracked lips. "If I had a choice," he mumbled, his words slurring together. "I would have picked a kinder neighbor." His eyes rolled back, and he went limp again. Maybelline let out a shaky breath. Above them, a horrific crash echoed, the sound of something immense being torn apart. The barn, she thought with a pang of cold sorrow, or the house. The cellar shuddered, and the jars on the shelves rattled a frantic tune. The wind howled like a legion of demons, a sound of pure, mindless fury. In that moment, she felt impossibly small, a tiny creature huddled in a burrow while the world was ripped to shreds above. All she could do was wait and pray that the roots of Silas's cottonwood tree held the earth together above her head. The roaring went on for an eternity, and then, slowly, it began to change. The violent, grinding noise receded, replaced by a sound like a great exhalation. The shaking subsided. The door above her head stopped rattling. A new sound began, the steady drumming of heavy rain, and then the sharp crack of hail. The worst of it was over. In the relative quiet, the man stirred again. Maybelline leaned closer with the lamp. She needed to know his name, in case he did not make it. "Hey," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "Mr. What is your name?" His blue eyes opened again. clearer this time. He looked at her, then around the small, dark space. He seemed to be trying to piece together the world. "Colt," he whispered, his voice barely a thread of sound. "Colt McCrae." He drifted back into unconsciousness. The name meant nothing to her. He was just a man, a life she had chosen to save over that of her beloved horse. The cost of her choice was still waiting for her up above, in the wreckage of her world. She sat back on her heels, the lamp resting on the dirt floor beside her. Its steady flame threw her weary shadow up against the cellar's main support beam. Her eyes traced the rough wood, and for the first time in years, she noticed the words Silas had carved into it long ago, a motto for their hard-won life on the plains. The lamplight made the letters stand out, each one a testament to his simple, powerful philosophy. Survive first, ask questions later. The world that greeted Maybelline when she finally pushed open the cellar door was a waterlogged ruin. The sky was a clean-scrubbed gray, weeping a steady, sorrowful rain onto a landscape of profound violence. Her house, miraculously, was still standing. Though it had been brutalized, most of the shingles were gone. One window was a gaping hole, and the porch had a drunken, sinking tilt. The barn was a splintered memory, a heap of timber and mangled tin, and where the corral had been, there was nothing but a few shattered posts. Daisy was gone. The tornado had taken her. The finality of it was a cold, smooth stone of grief that settled deep in Maybelline's chest. The land itself was unrecognizable, scoured and littered with the debris of other people's lives, a child's doll, a piece of a blue-painted chair, the splintered wheel of a wagon. The creek at the bottom of her property, normally a gentle ribbon of water, had become a churning, muddy torrent, effectively turning her small ranch into an island. There would be no riding into Dustwater for help. There would be no one riding out. They were alone. She got the stranger, Colt, out of the cellar and into her spare room, a small, plain space that had not been used since her mother had visited 3 years prior. He was mostly dead weight, conscious only in brief, pained flashes. She cleaned the gush on his forehead as best she could with boiled water and carbolic soap. It was deep, and she knew it needed stitches, a skill she did not possess. She bandaged it tightly with a strip torn from a clean sheet and could only hope it would be enough to keep the fever out. For 2 days, he was a ghost in her house, a presence defined by his shallow breathing and the occasional low moan. She fed him broth, spooning it between his cracked lips, and kept a cool, damp cloth on his brow. During those long, quiet hours, her caution was a living thing. Silas's revolver, which had always lived in the tool shed, now rested in the top drawer of the kitchen cabinet, nestled amongst the spare cutlery. Every time she entered the room to check on her patient, her hand would brush the drawer handle, a small, unconscious gesture of self-preservation. Trust was a currency she did not have to spare. On the 3rd morning, she woke to the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. For a disoriented moment, her heart leapt with a wild, impossible hope. The sound so deeply entwined with the memory of Silas, then reality crashed back in. She rose from her bed, pulling on her robe, and went to the kitchen window. Colt was in the yard, his back to her. He had found Silas's old axe and was methodically working his way through a fallen cottonwood branch that the storm had deposited near the house. He moved with a steady, practiced economy, his shoulders working smoothly under his torn shirt. He had found a pair of Silas's old work trousers, and they fit him well enough. He was still pale, and he leaned on the axe for a moment between swings. But he was working. He was not the helpless invalid from the cellar anymore. Their life fell into a new, unspoken routine. She would rise first, make coffee, and leave a mug for him on the stove. When she came back from tending to her surviving cattle, who had miraculously been spared in the far pasture, the mug would be empty, and he would be at work. He started with the most urgent tasks. He repaired the paddock gate he had been tangled in. his hammer blows echoing in the unnaturally quiet air. He cleared a path to what was left of the barn. He began the slow, arduous task of sorting salvageable timber from the wreckage. He did not speak much, neither did she. Their conversations were clipped, functional things, orbiting the tasks at hand. "There's more rope in the shed," she would say from the porch. He would just nod, not turning around. In the evenings, they would eat together at her small kitchen table. The silence between them was not entirely uncomfortable, filled as it was by the weariness of hard labor, but it was a watchful silence. She studied him over the rim of her soup bowl. He had a strong jaw, a straight nose, and those unsettlingly blue eyes that seemed to be looking at something far away, even when they were looking right at you. He had scars on his knuckles, old and white, the marks of a man familiar with fights or hard work, or both. One evening, as she was ladling stew, a log in the stove shifted and sent a shower of sparks up the flue with a sudden whoosh. Colt flinched violently, dropping his spoon with a clatter. His face went white, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He blinked, the moment passing as quickly as it came. He looked down at his trembling hand and then back at her, a look of profound confusion on his face. "Yes, I thought I heard," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I cannot remember." The nights were the worst. She would wake to the sound of his voice, a muffled cry from the other room. One night, it was so loud, so filled with raw panic, that she got up and went to his door, her hand hovering near the knob. He was shouting words, fragments of some unseen battle. "Get down! Smoke! The horses!" Then his voice broke on a name, a desperate, strangled cry. She could not make it out. She stood there for a long time, listening to his ragged breathing slowly even out into the rhythm of sleep. He was fighting a war in his head, a war whose origins were a mystery to him. It made her feel a reluctant stirring of pity, which was an emotion she could not afford. Pity made you weak. She was grateful for his work. There was no denying it. The sight of the patched porch roof, the neatly stacked firewood, the secured fence line, these were burdens lifted from her shoulders, but his presence was a constant, low-grade anxiety. She found herself thinking of Silas, of the stories he used to tell about the big ranches, the ones owned by men in faraway cities who held the fate of families like theirs in the palm of their hands. Men whose names were spoken in hushed, resentful tones in the Dustwater Saloon. Silas had worked himself into an early grave, trying to scrape together enough money to pay the exorbitant grazing fees demanded by one of those men. The power of the wealthy was a crushing, impersonal force, a storm of a different kind, and she wanted no part of it. She had saved this man's life, but she feared what it might cost her. An obligation, an expectation, a debt she did not ask for and could not possibly repay. About a week after the storm, the floodwaters had receded enough that the road was visible again, though it was a sea of mud. Colt had salvaged a long, sturdy beam from the barn wreckage, intending to replace the main support for the porch roof, which was cracked. He laid it across two sawhorses and began to measure it, his movements precise. Maybelline was on the porch, mending a tear in one of her last good shirts, watching him out of the corner of her eye. He finished his measurements and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of marking chalk. He needed to mark the wood for his cut. He did not write a simple X or a line. Instead, with a few swift, confident strokes, he drew a symbol. It was a stylized letter M, with the right leg sweeping down and curling back up to form an intertwined C. It was a brand. Maybelline's needle stopped mid-stitch. Her blood went cold. She had seen that mark before. Her mind flew back to trips to the mercantile, to the heavy burlap sacks of grain and flour stacked by the door, each one stenciled with that exact symbol, McCrae Ranch. The lettering above it read, She had seen it burned into the thick, sturdy fence posts that marked the vast borders of the ranch that sprawled over half the county, a kingdom of grass and cattle that dwarfed her own small holding. The McCrae Ranch was the power in this part of Kansas. It was an empire, and its owner was a figure of myth and rumor, a man no one in Dustwater ever seemed to see. He was just a name on a tax roll, a signature on a deed, a force as powerful and remote as the weather itself. She stared at the mark on the beam, then at the man standing over it. Colt McCrae. He had told her his name in the cellar, but in the chaos and exhaustion, it had been just a sound, a collection of syllables. Now, connected to that symbol, it took on a terrifying weight. The man she had pulled from the fence, the man sleeping in her spare room, the man patching her roof with timber from her own ruined barn, was a McCrae. He seemed to feel her gaze on him. He looked up, his blue eyes questioning something wrong. Maybelline forced her hands to remain steady. She lowered her sewing to her lap. No, nothing is wrong. Her mind was a whirlwind. Was it a coincidence? Could he just be a ranch hand? A distant relation? But ranch hands did not ride $1,000 horses with silver-trimmed saddles. And there was an air about him, even with his memory gone. A quiet confidence, an inborn sense of command in the way he stood, the way he assessed a problem. It was the feeling she had gotten from him in the cellar, the feeling that he was a man who had been taught to lead, even if he could not remember who or what he was supposed to be leading. He finished his cut, the saw biting through the wood with a steady rhythm. He fit the new beam into place, his movements sure and strong. He was a good worker. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. The son of the very empire that had pressed down on men like her husband was here, rebuilding her life, piece by piece. She had saved him, and in doing so, she had brought the one thing she feared most right into her own home, the shadow of great wealth, and the power that always came with it. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety for her. She was quiet, withdrawn, and if Colt noticed, he did not comment on it. He worked until the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the bruised plains in hues of orange and purple. The air grew cool and still. Maybelline stood on her newly stabilized porch, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders, watching the last of the light fade. Colt was gathering his tools, his silhouette dark against the twilight. The world felt small again, just the two of them in the vast, quiet emptiness of the prairie. A fragile peace had settled over the ranch in the days since the storm, an intimacy born of shared disaster and silent work. Now it felt like a lie. And then, on the crest of the western hill, where the sky still held a sliver of fiery color, a new silhouette appeared. It was sharp and unmistakable against the fading light. A rider on a horse. The figure sat motionless for a long moment, looking down at her small, isolated homestead. Their sanctuary had been found. The outside world was coming for them. Colt saw the rider at the same time she did. He straightened up from the tool pile, his hands shielding his eyes against the last rays of the sun. A stillness came over him, the watchful, focused stillness of a predator, or of prey. Maybelline felt a knot of pure dread tighten in her stomach. The fragile bubble of their isolation had just been pierced. For a week, this small, ruined patch of land had been the entire world, a world governed by the simple laws of survival and shared work. Now, the old laws, the ones of property and names and power, were riding down the hill to reclaim them. The rider did not hurry. He guided his horse with an easy, confident hand, navigating the debris-strewn landscape as if it were a familiar garden path. As he drew closer, Maybelline could make out the details. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, with a thick gray mustache and steady eyes that missed nothing. He wore the practical, durable clothes of a working man, but they were of a better quality than anything she saw in Dustwater. He rode a fine bay gelding, and a rifle was nestled in a leather scabbard by his saddle. He looked capable, serious, and worried. He pulled his horse to a halt, a respectful 10 paces from the porch, his eyes scanning the scene, the patched roof, the heap of salvaged timber, the woman standing small and defiant by the door, and finally, the man standing in the yard. His gaze fixed on Colt, and the worry on his face melted away, replaced by a wave of profound, bone-deep relief that seemed to make him sag in the saddle. He swung himself down from the horse with a single, fluid motion. He took off his hat, holding its brim in both his gnarled hands as if he were entering a church. He took a few steps forward, his boots sinking into the soft mud. He stopped, his eyes never leaving Colt's face. "Boss," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Boss, is that you? We have been searching for days. We feared the worst." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. "Boss?" Maybelline felt the porch board sway beneath her feet. It was not a question of possibility anymore, not a flicker of suspicion sparked by a chalk mark on a beam. It was a fact, delivered in a man's plain, earnest voice. The ground had shifted beneath her, and the world was no longer what it had been a moment before. Her patient, her silent partner in reconstruction, the man whose life she had held in her hands, was the owner of the McCrae Ranch. He was the cowboy who owned half the county. Colt simply stared at the man, his expression a blank wall of confusion. The word boss seemed to mean nothing to him. He looked from the foreman's relieved face to Maybelline's, which she knew must be a mask of stone. He saw something in her eyes, a shutter falling, a door closing, and a frown creased his bandaged forehead. "Do I know you?" Colt asked, his voice quiet. The foreman's name was Tom Wilkins, and his loyalty was as plain as the wrinkles around his eyes. He seemed to understand the situation with an instinct born of long service. He did not push, did not overwhelm. He spoke to Colt in a calm, steady tone, explaining that there had been an accident during the storm, that Colt had been riding the north fence line checking on a report of rustlers when the tornado hit. They had found his dead horse the next day, but of him there had been no sign until now. "The whole ranch has been in an uproar." "Mr. McCrae," Tom said, his address formal now, a clear sign of the hierarchy being reestablished. "Your aunt has been beside herself." Mr. McCrae. The name was a hammer blow, driving the reality home. Maybelline's mind flashed with a sudden, vivid memory of Silas sitting at this very kitchen table, his head in his hands, a letter from the McCrae land office on the table in front of him. The grazing fees were being raised again, beyond what they could possibly pay. "It is not right, May," he had whispered, his voice thick with helpless fury. A man works his fingers to the bone, and for what? So another man he has never even seen can get richer. The man he had never seen was standing in her yard, wearing her dead husband's trousers. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a sour, burning taste at the back of her throat. She had saved the life of the very man whose name had been a shadow over their lives, a symbol of the distant, unaccountable power that had helped to break her husband's spirit long before his body gave out. Tom Wilkins eventually turned his attention to her. He looked at her with a new respect, his eyes taking in her torn dress, the raw scratches on her hands, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and sincere, "it seems we all owe you a debt of gratitude we can never repay." Maybelline said nothing. She just gave a single, sharp nod. Gratitude was a currency for the rich. For her, there was only survival. Colt was struggling to process the flood of information. He kept looking at Tom, then back at his own hands, as if hoping to find a clue to his own identity written there. He was no longer just a man with a broken head. He was a man with a past, a family, a vast responsibility he could not remember. The weight of it seemed to settle on his shoulders, making him look lost and younger than he had a moment before. Tom, seeing his employer's distress, made his report brief. He said he would ride back to the main house, which was a good 2 hours away. and return with a carriage and proper supplies. He mounted his horse, gave a final, deferential nod to Colt, a look of polite acknowledgement to Maybelline, and rode back up the hill, disappearing over the crest. He left a silence in his wake that was 1,000 times heavier than the one before he had arrived. The sun had completely set, and the world was bathed in the soft, gray light of dusk. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and crushed sage. Colt finally turned to face her. He took a step toward the porch, his movements uncertain. The easy confidence he had shown with the axe and hammer was gone, replaced by a profound vulnerability. He saw the distance in her eyes, the wall that had gone up between them, and it confused him. "McCrae," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "He said my name is McCrae." Maybelline wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. Her arms crossed over her chest in a gesture of pure self-defense. Her voice, when it came, was as dry and brittle as a dead leaf. "Have you remembered how rich you are yet?" The question was not meant to be cruel. Not entirely. It was the only weapon she had, a small, sharp sliver of irony to protect her from the overwhelming absurdity of her situation. It was the voice of every small rancher, every tenant farmer, every person who had ever felt the boot of the McCrae empire on their neck. He looked genuinely taken aback, not by the question itself, but by the bitter edge in her voice. He saw her pain, even if he could not comprehend its source. He shook his head slowly, his gaze honest and direct. "No," he said, his voice low and certain. "I have not, but I remember that I owe you a debt." His sincerity was disarming. He did not understand the history, the class divide, the years of quiet resentment his name carried. He only understood the simple, immediate truth she had saved his life. In his broken memory, that was the only ledger that mattered, and for a moment, the wall around her heart cracked. He was not the faceless tycoon from Silas's stories. He was just a man, lost and injured, who was trying to make sense of a world that had been stolen from him. But the reality of their positions could not be ignored. Her house was barely habitable. She was almost out of food. The tax bill was still on her table, a ticking clock counting down to her ruin. She was on an island of poverty, and he was the continent of wealth that surrounded her. He must have seen the desperation in her face, the weariness that went bone deep. He took another step closer, his voice gentle. "Tom said my home is 2 hours from here. He said there are doctors and food and workers who can fix this." He gestured to the broken house. "The ruined landscape. You cannot stay here like this. It is not safe. Come back with me, to the ranch, just until your home is repaired. I will see to it. It is the least I can do." Pride warred with practicality inside her. The thought of accepting charity from a McCrae was galling. It felt like a betrayal of Silas, of everything they had fought for. To walk into the enemy's camp, to eat his food and sleep under his roof, felt like a surrender. But then she looked at the gaping window, felt the damp chill that was already seeping into the house, and thought of the long, cold winter that was not so far away. Survival had no room for pride. She had survived a tornado. She would survive this, too. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "For a little while," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "until the house is fixed." The relief on his face was immediate and genuine. It was not the relief of a rich man bestowing a favor, but of a decent man trying to honor a debt. True to his word. Tom Wilkins returned just as the last of the light faded completely. He was not alone. He brought a sturdy carriage drawn by 2 strong horses, and another rider leading a spare mount. They brought blankets, a lantern, and a hamper filled with food that smelled so rich and wonderful, it made Maybelline's stomach ache with hunger. She packed a small bag with her few spare clothes, a brush, and a small, faded photograph of her and Silas, taken on their wedding day. She looked around the small, battered house. It was all she had in the world, and she was leaving it. As she stepped out onto the porch, Colt was there, waiting for her. He took her bag from her hand without a word and placed it in the carriage. The journey was a strange, dreamlike passage through the dark. The carriage was comfortable, sprung with leather and lined with velvet, a world away from the rough buckboard she was used to. It smelled of polish and money for most of the ride. They sat in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves and the creak of the harness. After what felt like an eternity, the carriage turned off the muddy, rutted track and onto a road that was smooth and wide, paved with fine white gravel that crunched under the wheels. They were on McCrae land now. Soon, a fence appeared alongside the road, not of rough wood and wire, but of tall, elegant wrought iron. It went on, a black spine curving through the darkness. Then she saw the gates. They were immense, a towering arch of iron twisted into the shape of leaves and vines, with the familiar M&C brand worked into the center. They swung open silently as they approached, manned by a lantern-bearing guard. The carriage passed through, and Maybelline felt a profound sense of crossing a threshold into another country. The drive wound through a parkland of ancient, manicured trees, finally circling around to the front of the main house. It was not a house. It was a mansion, a sprawling two-story structure of pale stone, with dozens of windows blazing with light. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, beautiful but cold, a statement of power built to last for centuries. A servant opened the carriage door. Colt stepped out first, then turned and offered her his hand. She hesitated for a second before taking it. His grip was firm and warm. She stepped down onto the gravel, her worn work boots feeling clumsy and out of place. She walked with him up the wide stone steps and through a set of massive oak doors into the entrance hall. The space was cavernous, with a polished marble floor and a grand staircase that swept upward into the shadows. But what made her stop dead, her breath catching in her throat, was the ceiling. High above her, hanging from a thick chain, was a chandelier. It was a waterfall of crystal and light, 1,000 tiny flames reflecting in a million facets, so brilliant and complex it hurt to look at. It was bigger than her entire kitchen. It did not look like a light fixture. It looked like a constellation of stars, a strange and distant sky, impossibly far out of her reach. A woman emerged from the shadows of a wide, arching hallway, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was more intimidating than a shout. She was tall and slender, her hair a perfect silver coronet, her black silk dress making no sound on the marble floor. Her face was a mask of polite inquiry, her eyes the color of a winter sky. And they took in Maybelline's entire existence, the muddy boots, the torn skirt, the wind-chapped skin in a single, sweeping glance that was as dismissive as a flick of a wrist. This was Josephine, Colt's aunt. Though she carried herself with the authority of a queen, she did not rush to embrace her nephew. Instead, she placed a cool, dry hand on his arm, her touch a gesture of assessment rather than affection. "Colton," she said, her voice low and impeccably clear. "We were gravely concerned. You are injured." It was a statement, not a question. "I am fine, Josephine," Colt said, though the name sounded foreign and uncertain on his lips. This is the woman who saved me, Maybelline Crane." Josephine's gaze fell upon Maybelline again, and this time there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a cold and calculating light. "Mrs. Crane," she said, her voice a shade cooler. "The entire McCrae estate is in your debt." The words were correct, but the tone suggested the debt was an unfortunate inconvenience, like a tradesman's bill that would be settled and promptly forgotten. The days that followed were a disorienting blend of suffocating luxury and subtle hostility. Maybelline was given a room larger than her entire cabin, with a 4-poster bed so high she needed a stool to climb into it, and curtains made of heavy, crimson velvet. A young maid laid out a selection of Josephine's old dresses for her. beautiful garments of silk and fine wool that fit poorly and felt like costumes, erasing the woman who worked the land and replacing her with a pale, uncomfortable imitation of a lady. A doctor from Dustwater, a grim man with a perpetually worried expression, came and examined Colt. The diagnosis was simple and frustrating. The blow to his head had stolen his memory, and there was no telling when, or if, it would return. He was physically healing, but his past remained a blank canvas. This fact seemed to please Emmett Kessler, the ranch's general foreman, an altogether different breed of man from the loyal Tom Wilkins. Kessler was a man who smiled too much, his teeth too white, his eyes constantly moving. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, and he treated Colt with a fawning deference that felt fundamentally dishonest. The first formal dinner was a trial by fire. Maybelline sat at a dining table that stretched for what felt like a mile, a gleaming, polished expanse of mahogany that reflected the crystal chandelier like a dark, still lake. She was seated between a tight-lipped Josephine and the ever-smiling Emmett Kessler. Colt sat at the head of the table, looking lost and out of place in his own home. The fine suit they had put him in looking as much a costume on him as her borrowed dress felt on her. It must be a tremendous burden, running a ranch all by your lonesome, Mrs. Crane. Kessler began, his voice smooth as honey, especially for a woman of your delicate constitution. Maybelline placed her fork down gently, meeting his gaze without flinching. There is nothing delicate about my constitution, Mr. Kessler, and the work is only a burden if you are afraid of it. I am not. Of course not, Josephine interjected, her voice like the chime of a tiny, ice-cold bell. Still, one imagines the solitude must be quite trying. We are so very grateful you were there for Colton. A true blessing that your little homestead was so near the fence line. Her words painted Maybelline as a fortunate peasant, a tool of providence placed conveniently in the path of her betters. I do not think the tornado was much concerned with convenience. Ma'am, Maybelline replied, her voice even. It took my horse and my barn, but it left a man's life in its place. I would call that a fair trade. Her simple, direct honesty seemed to wrong-foot them. They exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. The rest of the meal passed in a state of heavily armed politeness. The story of the rescue, however, refused to remain within the stone walls of the mansion. A few days later, Tom Wilkins brought the mail and the weekly edition of the Dustwater Chronicle from town. The headline, in thick black letters, was impossible to miss. Destitute widow pulls stranger from tornado's wrath, discovers Cowboy owns half the county. Colt read the article aloud, his voice flat with disbelief. The story painted a dramatic, romanticized picture, casting him as a helpless prince and her as the noble pauper who had saved him, with the unspoken question of her reward hanging over every sentence. It made her feel cheap, like a gambler who had stumbled upon a winning hand by accident. The town was talking. The whole county was talking. The weight of their judgment, their suspicion, pressed down on her even in the isolation of the grand estate. That night, she found a piece of folded paper slipped under her door. The writing was crude, spelled out in blocky, uneven letters. It contained only 5 words. Leave while you still can. Her blood ran cold. This was no longer about class prejudice or subtle insults. This was a threat. Her first instinct was to burn it, to pretend it had never happened. She was a guest here, a charity case. Causing trouble was the surest way to be cast out. But when Colt knocked on her door a few minutes later to ask a simple question about the next day's work schedule for the men he had sent to her farm, he saw the look on her face. What is it, he asked, the concern in his eyes immediate and genuine. What is wrong? She could not lie to him. She handed him the note. He read it, and a change came over his face. The confused, amnesiac patient disappeared, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the man he must have been before the storm hard, authoritative and dangerous. A cold fury settled in his blue eyes. Who would do this, he said, his voice a low growl. I do not know, she whispered. Someone who does not want me here. The next afternoon, the threat escalated from paper to poison. Josephine had insisted Maybelline join her for afternoon tea in the sunroom, a beautiful glass-walled space filled with ferns and flowers. Emmett Kessler was there as well, discussing some matter of cattle futures with Josephine. A maid served the tea. Maybelline, her nerves on edge since finding the note, drank hers, the warm liquid doing little to soothe the knot in her stomach. It started with a slight dizziness, a blurring at the edges of her vision. Then a wave of nausea so powerful it made her gasp. The teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tiled floor. My dear, are you unwell? Josephine asked, her concern perfectly feigned. Maybelline tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her. The room was spinning, the vibrant colors of the flowers melting into a sickening swirl. She was vaguely aware of Colt bursting into the room, drawn by the sound of the shattering cup. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was his face, a mask of pure panic. As he shouted her name, she woke up in her velvet-draped bed, the grim-faced doctor forcing a foul-tasting emetic down her throat. Colt was pacing at the foot of her bed like a caged wolf. He had exploded with a rage that had shocked everyone, calling the doctor back from town at a full gallop, overriding his aunt's placid assurances that it was merely a case of a weak stomach. It was the tea, he said to her later, his voice tight with suppressed fury. After the doctor had confirmed she had ingested a mild but effective poison, likely derived from a common garden plant. Someone in this house tried to harm you. The attack, as terrifying as it was, had a galvanizing effect. For Colt, it was a line that had been crossed. For Maybelline, it burned away the last of her shame at being a guest, a burden. She was no longer a charity case, she was a target. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. His memory was a blank, but his instincts were sharp. He knew, with a certainty that defied his amnesia, that his empire was sick. Something is rotten here, he said to her in the quiet of the ranch office. A room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and old paper. I do not know how to run this place anymore, but I know how to read a ledger. My father made sure of that. They began to look. At first, they were cautious, pulling down the heavy, leather-bound books at night, after the rest of the house was asleep. They started with the payrolls, the supply invoices, the cattle sale receipts. It was slow, painstaking work. Maybelline, with her practical, hard-won knowledge of what it truly cost to run a ranch, saw it first. This is wrong, she said, her finger tracing a line in the accounts book. They have an invoice here for 500 feet of barbed wire, delivered last month. I was in the mercantile 2 weeks ago. Mister, Gable was complaining he could not get any wire for love nor money since the spring floods. Where did this come from? It was a small crack, but when they pushed, it widened into a chasm. They found dozens of such invoices, for phantom supplies, for ghost workers. They found cattle sales recorded at a fraction of their market value. And on every suspicious document, every forged invoice, every questionable contract was the same fluid. Confident signature, Emmett Kessler. Colt stared at one of the forged documents, a land lease agreement signed with a clumsy imitation of his own name. He let out a short, dry laugh, devoid of any humor. I do not remember my own life, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. But I remember my penmanship. I certainly do not write well enough to be signing away my own land without noticing. The web of deceit was deeper and more tangled than they could have imagined. Kessler was not just skimming off the top. He was systematically gutting the ranch, diverting its assets into shell companies and falsifying the records to cover his tracks. He was using Colt's amnesia as a shield, counting on the fact that the boss could not call him out on a lie if he did not remember the truth. They knew they needed more than just a stack of suspicious invoices. They needed definitive proof. something Kessler could not explain away. They needed his own records. The question was, where would a man like that hide his secrets? The answer came to Maybelline in a flash of intuition. A man like Emmett Kessler, who wore fine suits and smelled of expensive cologne, would never dirty his own hands. But he trusted the old ways, the physical world of leather and wood. He would not hide his secrets in the house, where Josephine's prying eyes missed nothing. He would hide them somewhere he felt was his own domain. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating opulence of the mansion for another minute, she walked down to the stables. The air inside was warm and alive, smelling of hay and horsehide and honest work. It was a scent that felt like home. She ran a hand along the neck of a beautiful Palomino mare, and for a moment, she let the grief for Daisy wash over her. She saw Tom Wilkins, his face etched with worry, polishing a saddle in the dim lantern light. They spoke for a few minutes, their conversation circling the unspoken tension that had gripped the ranch. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a row of old, disused tack lockers at the far end of the stable. One of them was newer than the others, its lock shinier, its wood less weathered. It was Emmett Kessler's. Later that night, after the house was dark and silent, she crept back out, with a piece of stiff wire she had taken from the mending basket. She worked at the lock, her heart pounding. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, beneath a pile of old rags, was a small, flat box, and inside the box, wrapped in a sheet of oilskin to protect it from the damp, was a small, unassuming ledger book. She opened it. The first page was a list of names and figures, a clear and damning record of bribes, kickbacks, and stolen profits. She had found it. She held the proof of Emmett Kessler's treason in her hands. The discovery of the oilskin ledger changed the air in the mansion from one of polite tension to the quiet, humming stillness that precedes a lightning strike. They had the proof, a black and white accounting of Emmett Kessler's treachery. But possessing the weapon and knowing how to wield it were two entirely different things. The house, which had once felt merely oppressive, now felt dangerous. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching eye. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep in the hall. Maybelline felt the walls closing in, the velvet and mahogany suffocating her. It was Colt who suggested it. He found her standing by a window in the library, staring out at the rolling hills without really seeing them. He looked pale and strained. The constant effort of trying to piece together his own life while fighting a battle for its future was taking its toll. "I cannot breathe in this house," he said, his voice low. "Let us ride out, away from all this." The offer was a lifeline. An hour later, they were in the stables, the familiar, comforting scent of horse and leather a balm to their frayed nerves. Tom Wilkins, his face a mask of worried loyalty, saddled 2 horses for them without a word, a sturdy gelding for Colt and the gentle Palomino mare Maybelline had admired. To be on horseback again, to feel the powerful muscles of the animal moving beneath her, was to feel a piece of her old self returning. They rode west, away from the grand house and its manicured lawns, toward the wilder, untamed hills covered in the silvery green of sagebrush. The land here still bore the scars of the tornado, but the prairie was already healing itself. New blades of grass, a vibrant, impossible green, pushed up through the scoured earth. The air was clean and sharp, and the vast, open sky felt like a promise of freedom. They did not speak for the first hour, content to let the rhythm of the ride and the immensity of the landscape wash over them. Colt led them to a high, wind-swept ridge that overlooked the entire valley. From here, the great stone mansion looked like a child's toy, a tiny, insignificant thing in the vast sweep of the land. They could see for miles in every direction, the checkerboard of pastures and fields stretching to the horizon. It was a kingdom, and it was his. But his expression was not that of a king surveying his domain. It was the face of a stranger in a strange land. They dismounted and built a small fire, more for comfort than for warmth. Colt gathered dry sagebrush and a few fallen branches, and soon a tiny flame was flickering between them, its smoke carrying the clean, sharp scent of the prairie into the air. They sat on a flat rock, sharing a canteen of water and a piece of bread a sympathetic cook had pressed into Maybelline's hand as they left. The fire seemed to burn away their pretense, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of their situation. It was Colt who spoke first, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "I have these flashes," he began, his voice hesitant. "Not memories, more like feelings. I remember the weight of a book in my hands, the smell of ink, and a voice. My father's, I think, telling me that a man is only worth the land he controls and the profit it turns. He was not a cruel man, just practical. He was building an empire, and he needed an heir who could run it." He picked up a twig and poked at the fire, his gaze distant. "I do not think he ever asked me what I wanted. I was a tool to be sharpened, a gear in the machine of this ranch. I was taught how to command, how to calculate, how to win. I was groomed to be a useful successor, not a loved son." He looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a profound and lonely confusion. Is it possible to miss a life you cannot even remember feeling? The quiet tragedy of his words resonated deep within her. He was a prisoner of a legacy he did not choose, just as she was a prisoner of the poverty it had created. His confession unspooled something inside her, a knot of old grief and resentment she had held tight for 2 long years. "My husband, Silas," she began, her own voice quiet, finding a strength in the shared vulnerability of the moment. "He did not die of a sickness. He died of a debt." She looked out over the valley, seeing not the greening fields, but the parched, unforgiving landscape of her own past. "We had an old reaping machine. It was all we could afford. It was always breaking down, and Silas was always patching it together with wire and prayer. The harvest was late that year, and the bank was threatening to foreclose. The grazing fees had gone up again." She did not say the McCrae name, but it hung in the air between them, a ghost at their small fire. "He was out there from sunup to sundown, pushing that old machine, pushing himself. He was so tired he could barely stand. I begged him to rest, but he said the bank would not wait. The machine, it jammed. A belt slipped. He tried to clear it without shutting the whole thing down. He was trying to save time. A few precious minutes." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "His sleeve got caught. It pulled him in. By the time I got to him, it was too late." She fell silent, the terrible images replaying in her mind. She had never told anyone the full story, the ugly, helpless truth of it. It was a private shame, a testament to their powerlessness. Colt did not offer any empty words of comfort. He just listened, his face a study in dawning comprehension. He was finally seeing the other side of the ledger, the human cost of the empire his father had built. The name McCrae was not just a brand on a fence post, it was a weight that had crushed a good man to death. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a recognition of the 2 sides of the same cruel coin. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, and the small fire crackled, a tiny beacon of warmth against the vast, indifferent landscape. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, Colt reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, his touch gentle. She did not pull away. In that simple contact, something shifted, a fundamental realignment of the world. The debt she was owed, the obligation he felt, all of it dissolved in the heat of the fire. This was no longer about a life saved and a life owed. This was a choice. 2 lonely people on a windswept hill, choosing to reach for each other in the midst of the storm. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway. His forehead rested against hers, and she closed her eyes. It was an intimacy more profound than any kiss. a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried. Then, his lips brushed against hers, a touch as light and gentle as the prairie wind, a question and an answer, all in one. It was a promise of partnership, a quiet declaration that they would face what was coming not as a rancher and a widow, but as two people standing together. When they finally drew apart, the sun was lower in the sky, and the purpose between them had crystallized. "This is not just about Kessler anymore, is it?" Colt said, his voice imbued with a new, quiet authority that came not from a remembered legacy, but from a present and powerful conviction. "It is about the man who died because he could not afford a new belt for his reaper. It is about every family that has to choose between feeding their children and paying the fees on land they have worked their whole lives." He looked out over the valley, his valley, and for the first time, she saw a king who was not thinking of his kingdom, but of his people. "When I get this back," he said, his voice hard as iron, "it is going to be different." A sense of rightness, of purpose, settled over Maybelline. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. It was for Silas. It was for every family like hers. They stayed there as the sky turned to gold and then to a deep, bruised purple, reluctant to leave the peace of the ridge and return to the battle waiting below. The fire burned down to a pile of glowing embers, a small heart of warmth in the gathering twilight. And then, a sound drifted up from the valley below, faint but clear on the evening air. It was a bell, but not the slow, warning toll of a storm. It was a steady, insistent ringing, a sound of civic importance. The town hall bell, a summons. They looked at each other, the quiet understanding on their faces replaced by a new, shared alarm. The bell could mean only one thing. Their enemies had made the next move. Kessler and Josephine were no longer content with quiet threats and hidden poisons. They were bringing the battle out into the open, using the law as their weapon. A deep, chilling certainty settled in Maybelline's heart. The summons was not for Emmett Kessler. It was for Colt, a formal notice, delivered from the county seat, a legal challenge, a petition for a hearing to determine his fitness, his mental capacity to govern the vast holdings of the McCrae Ranch. The meeting room of the Dustwater County Council smelled of old paper, oiled wood, and the collective anxiety of the 20 or so people crammed inside. It was a room built for sober decisions, not for drama. A single massive oak table dominated the space, its surface scarred with the history of 100 forgotten arguments. Behind it sat the 3 council members, stern, sun-weathered men in stiff collars who looked deeply uncomfortable with the spectacle they were presiding over. The air was thick with whispers, the rustle of clothing, and the low, judgmental hum of a town that had come to see a verdict rendered not just on a man's mind, but on the entire rigid structure of their world. Maybelline sat beside Colt at a small table set before the council, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Inside, a flock of terrified birds beat against her ribs. She wore one of Josephine's simpler dresses, a dark blue wool that she had altered herself to fit. A small act of defiance, of making something foreign her own. Colt sat beside her, his stillness a force in itself. He was not the confused patient from her spare room, nor the lost man on the ridge. He was a man prepared for a fight, his gaze clear and steady, his jaw set. Across the room, in the front row of spectator chairs, sat Josephine. She was the picture of regal composure, her face a beautiful, unreadable mask of ivory. Beside her, at another small table, was Emmett Kessler, looking confident and aggrieved, every inch the loyal servant wrongfully accused. Next to him was his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Kansas City named Finch, whose suit was too slick and whose smile was too thin for the dusty confines of Dustwater. The hearing began. Finch spoke first, his voice a smooth, polished instrument of condescension. He painted a masterful picture of a beloved community leader, a man of property and standing, struck down by a terrible act of God. He spoke of Colt's disorientation, his confusion, his tragic loss of memory. He made it sound like a disease, a weakness of the mind that left him vulnerable. And into this tragic vacuum, Finch said, turning his gaze on Maybelline with theatrical pity, steps a figure of circumstance, a destitute widow, a woman of no means, who happens upon Mr. McCrae in his most helpless state. We do not question her initial actions. Indeed, we commend them, but we must, as prudent stewards of this county's greatest asset, question what has followed. He began to lay out his case. He spoke of the exorbitant sums of money being spent to rebuild Maybelline's small, insignificant farm, presenting paid invoices for lumber and labor as evidence of Colt's fiscal irresponsibility. He described Colt's reliance on her, his constant presence at her side, as the textbook definition of undue influence. "We have here a man whose mind has been addled by trauma," Finch declared, his voice rising with false sympathy. "A man who is being manipulated by a woman of considerable, if rustic, charm. He is making decisions that are not only financially unsound, but that jeopardize the stability of the entire McCrae estate, an estate that employs half the men in this very room. We are not here to punish Mr. McCrae. We are here to protect him, to protect this community. We ask this council to appoint a temporary conservator to manage his affairs until such time as he is deemed, by a competent physician, to be fully restored to his senses." The implication was clear. The conservator would be his loving aunt, Josephine, with the trusted Emmett Kessler to advise her. When he finished, a murmur went through the crowd. He had played on their deepest prejudices, their suspicion of outsiders, their distrust of women who stepped outside their prescribed roles, their fear of instability. The council chairman, a grim-faced rancher named Abernathy, turned his gaze to Colt. "Mr. McCrae, do you have a response?" Colt rose to his feet slowly. He did not look at Finch or the council. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the merchants, the farmers, the ranch hands, the people of his county. "My memory of the last several years is gone," he began, his voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I will not deny it. I have been told I am a man of great wealth. I have been told I am a man of great power. But what I know, what I remember with perfect clarity, is the feeling of wire cutting into my skin and the sound of a tornado that wanted to tear the world apart. And I remember a woman, a stranger, risking her own life to drag me into a storm cellar." He turned his head and looked at Maybelline, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This man," he said, gesturing briefly toward Finch, "would have you believe that the person who saved my life is now trying to ruin it. He wants you to believe that the man who has been systematically bleeding this ranch dry for years is the one trying to save it." He then turned his full attention to the council, his eyes hard as blue steel. "I may not remember every deal I have made, or every dollar I have spent, but I know the difference between a debt of gratitude and a debt of theft. I trust the person who saved my life more than I trust the man who has been gutting this land." His words were simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. A new murmur went through the room, this one of a different tone. Finch's slick legal arguments suddenly seemed flimsy and dishonest next to Colt's plain-spoken truth. "These are baseless accusations," Finch sputtered, jumping to his feet. "Where is your proof?" Colt looked at Maybelline and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This was her moment. She stood up, and for a second, she felt a tremor in her knees. Then she thought of Silas, of his broken body and his broken dreams, and a cold, hard calm settled over her. She was no longer just Maybelline Crane, the struggling widow. She was an agent of a justice long overdue. She walked to the great oak table, her worn boots making no sound on the floorboards, in her hands. She carried 2 items, the oilskin-wrapped ledger and one of the forged land transfer documents they had found in the office. She placed them side by side on the polished wood in front of the chairman. "This," she said, her voice not loud but so clear and steady that the room fell completely silent to hear it. "Is Mr. Kessler's private account book? It was found in his personal locker in the stables." Finch objected loudly, but the chairman waved him to silence, his eyes intrigued. "And this," Maybelline continued, pointing to the other document, "is a contract transferring the water rights of the South Pasture to a company called the Kansas Land Development Corporation. It is signed with what is supposed to be Mr. McCrae's name." She then opened the ledger. "According to this book, the Kansas Land Development Corporation has been paying Mr. Kessler 10% of its profits for the last 2 years. And according to the county clerk's office, the sole proprietor of that corporation is a man named Emmett Kessler." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She then slid the two documents closer together. "And if you look at the signature on this contract, and then look at the true signature of Mr. McCrae, which I am sure you have on file, you will see it is a forgery, a clumsy one." At that, a collective gasp went through the room. Chairman Abernathy picked up the contract, his brow furrowed. He pulled a file from the stack of papers in front of him and opened it. Comparing the signatures, the other two council members leaned in, their expressions grim. All eyes turned to Emmett Kessler. The slick, confident smile was gone, melted away to reveal the panicked, sweating man beneath. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. His face, which had been a healthy outdoorsman's tan, had turned a pasty, sickly white. He looked at Josephine, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes, but she did not meet his gaze. Her face was a statue, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she were alone in the room. The council members exchanged a look. No words were needed. "Mr. Kessler," the chairman said, his voice flat and cold, "you will remain here. Sheriff, I believe we have a matter for you to attend to." It was over. The tension in the room broke like a fever. In that moment of stunned silence, Colt stood and walked to Maybelline's side, in front of the council, in front of his aunt, in front of the entire town of Dustwater. He reached down and took her hand. He did not just hold it, he laced his fingers through hers. A firm, public declaration of partnership, of alliance, of something more. The gesture silenced the last of the whispers. It was an answer to every accusation Finch had made, a testament to a bond forged not in greed or manipulation, but in the heart of a storm. Colt turned back to the council, his hand holding hers. "The McCrae Ranch is more than just a business," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "It is the heart of this county, and it will be run with honor. The days of exploiting this land and its people are over." The chairman nodded curtly. "This council finds no merit in the petition to question Mr. McCrae's competence. His ownership and authority are affirmed. As for Mr. Kessler, we are opening a formal investigation into charges of fraud and theft." Josephine rose from her chair with a quiet, deliberate grace. She did not look at anyone. She simply turned and walked out of the room, her back ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. She was a pillar of an old, broken order, retreating in silent, dignified defeat. The sheriff, a large, slow-moving man, walked over to Emmett Kessler and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around Kessler's wrists echoed in the suddenly quiet room. The human storm, the one born of greed and deceit, had finally blown itself out. Later that evening, as they rode in the carriage back toward the mansion, the air felt lighter, cleaner, as they passed through the great iron gates, which now stood open. A gust of wind swept down from the hills, kicking up the dust on the long gravel drive and sending a swirl of dead leaves dancing into the air. The storm was over. Colt was quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was not looking at the looming stone edifice of his house. He was looking past it, to the west, where the last light of the sun was painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. His eyes were focused on a particular spot, a high, wind-swept ridge covered in the silvery green of sagebrush, the place where he had built a small fire, the place where he had finally understood what it meant to choose a home, rather than simply inherit one. The return to the mansion was not a homecoming. It was the closing of a chapter, the final accounting of a life neither of them wanted. Josephine was gone by the time they arrived. She had packed a single trunk, her movements as quiet and precise as always, and had taken the morning train east without a word of farewell. She left behind a house that was perfectly ordered, impeccably clean, and as cold and empty as a tomb. She had been the heart of the old McCrae empire, and without her, the great stone house was just a collection of rooms, a museum of a life that no longer existed. In the days that followed, Colt moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with conviction. He did not sit in the grand, leather-bound chair in the ranch office. Instead, he called a meeting of every tenant farmer and every ranch hand on the McCrae payroll. They gathered not in the intimidating grand hall, but in the wide, open yard in front of the main stables, under the vast Kansas sky. They came cautiously, their faces etched with the worry of men who expected the worst. They had seen owners come and go, had seen foremen hired and fired. They expected new rules, higher fees, a tightening of the screws. Colt stood on the steps of the bunkhouse, with Maybelline and a visibly proud Tom Wilkins at his side. He looked out at the sea of weathered faces, men who had given their sweat and their years to this land. And he did not see assets on a ledger. He saw partners. "There are going to be some changes," he began, his voice carrying in the still morning air. The men shifted, their shoulders tensing. "For years, this ranch has been run with an eye toward profit above all else. That ends today." He laid out his plan, his words simple, direct, and revolutionary. He was dissolving the old system of tenant farming and grazing fees. Any family that had worked a piece of McCrae land for more than 10 years would be given the deed to that land, free and clear, with the sole condition that they could not sell it to a large corporation for another 20 years. The ranch hands would be given a share of the yearly profits, their salaries raised to a fair wage. A stunned silence greeted his announcement. The men looked at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning, incredulous hope. An old farmer at the front, a man whose back was permanently bent from a lifetime of labor, took off his dusty hat. "Mr. McCrae," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you cannot be serious." "I am," Colt said. "My father believed the land belonged to the man who owned the deed. I believe the land belongs to the people who love it, who pour their lives into it. This ranch is nothing without you. It is time you owned a piece of what you have built." The silence broke. A single man began to clap, then another, and another, until the yard erupted in a ragged, heartfelt cheer that was more powerful than any polite applause that had ever echoed through the mansion's marble halls. It was the sound of justice, arriving not with the bang of a gavel, but with the quiet dignity of a promise kept. That evening, Colt and Maybelline stood in the grand dining room for the last time. The crystal chandelier glittered above them, casting cold, perfect light on the polished table. "This is not a home," Colt said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It is a monument." "A beautiful one," Maybelline said softly, "but it is not ours." They left the next morning. They took only what they needed: 2 good horses, some tools, a few clothes, and the small, oilskin-wrapped ledger, which Colt kept as a reminder. They did not look back. They rode west to the high wind-swept ridge overlooking the valley, the place where they had chosen each other. They began to build. They did not hire a crew from town. They built their home with their own 4 hands. Colt, his muscles lean and strong from his week of labor at her old farm, felled the timber himself. The rhythmic thud of his axe, a steady heartbeat on the quiet hill. He shaped the logs, notched them, and raised the walls. his movements sure and practiced. He was not the heir to an empire. He was a man building a sanctuary. Maybelline worked alongside him, her hands, which had been softened by her time in the mansion, quickly growing calloused again. She mixed the daubing for the walls, helped him hoist the beams, and planted a garden in the rich soil, in the spot where they had built their small fire. She planted a patch of lavender, its clean, calming scent, a promise of the peace they were building. Each nail he drove, each seed she planted, was an act of creation, a defiant statement that a home was not something you inherited, but something you made. Their life found a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by a social calendar. They ate simple meals on a porch that faced the sunset. They talked for hours, filling in the blank spaces of his past not with facts and figures, but with dreams for their future. The old rumors in Dustwater, of the scheming widow and the addled millionaire, slowly faded, replaced by a new, quieter story of the couple on the hill. The house was not large. It had one main room with a large stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom. It was solid, honest, and filled with the light of the prairie. It was more beautiful to her than any room in the stone mansion. One afternoon, as the house was nearing completion, they were standing outside, admiring their work. Colt was putting the finishing touches on the fence that enclosed their small yard, tamping the earth around a post with a heavy mallet. The fence was not the ornate, intimidating iron of the McCrae estate, but a simple, sturdy wooden fence, built to keep a future milk cow in, not to keep the world out. Maybelline stood beside him, her hand resting on the smooth, sun-warmed wood of a fence rail. She watched him work, the easy, powerful swing of his arms, the contentment on his face. A soft, gentle breeze stirred the silvery leaves of the sage and carried the scent of her lavender up the hill. She placed her other hand on her stomach, a small, almost unconscious gesture. "Colt," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped, leaning the mallet against the post, and turned to her, a smile in his eyes. "What is it?" "I have been thinking," she said, a slow smile spreading across her own face. "I think we might need another room." He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion for a moment. He looked at the small, perfect house, and then his gaze followed her hand, which was still resting on her belly. Understanding dawned, and the change that came over his face was a thing of pure, unadulterated joy. The confusion, the loneliness, the weight of his past, all of it vanished, burned away by a light so bright it seemed to illuminate him from within. He dropped the mallet. It fell to the earth with a soft thud. In 2 long strides, he was in front of her. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and buried his face in her hair. His shoulders shook with a silent, profound emotion. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a spinning world. When he finally drew back, his eyes were shining. He knelt before her and gently placed his large, calloused hand over hers on her stomach. "3 hearts," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. 3 hearts under one roof. As the seasons turned, the small house on the hill became a fixture in the landscape. Dustwater County remained a hard place, a land of unpredictable weather and long, quiet struggles. But for the people who lived there, something had shifted. The unwritten law of survival at any cost was slowly being replaced by a new one. In the evenings, as the wind swept down from the hills, a single, steady light would begin to glow from the window of the small house on the sage-covered ridge. It was not the cold, distant glitter of a mansion's chandelier. It was the warm, golden light of a home, a beacon that spoke not of power or of wealth, but of the simple, enduring truth that kindness was the only law that truly mattered. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from to connect with our community. Subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.